Good afternoon and welcome to the latest edition of Learning Communities Office Hours. Today, I'm going to be discussing culture in a virtual environment, and the professors are in. So I'd like to thank the professors and other experts that have joined us today to discuss the topic. Very quickly, we're going to ask each of them to quickly introduce themselves, starting with Lauren. So Lauren, why don't you go ahead?
Great. Thank you, Joe. I am glad to be back. And I do a blend of work with Wharton, both teaching classes on management, high-performing teams, strategic persuasion, and communication. And I work for a program based out of Harvard called Leadership for a Networked World, where we have an opportunity to work with chief transformation officers in a whole range of disciplines. Glad to be back.
Great. And joining us today also is Maddie Boyer. So Maddie.
Hi, I'm Madeline Boyer. My background is in culture anthropology, specifically organizational culture, workplace culture, and the future of work. I have, in my past life, taught at Wharton, undergraduate, graduate executive, and now am in management consulting, and excited to be here today.
Great. Welcome. Renee?
Hi, I'm Renee Torsha. I am trained as an anthropologist and have a background in management consulting. And for the last 5 years or so, I oversee HR for a data analytics company in the New York area.
Great. Welcome. And Bob?
Hello, everybody. My name is Bob Parker. I run a program, an experiential learning program called the Pit Crew Challenge, which is all about building high-performing cultures.
And Scott?
Great. Hi, folks. Scott Crower. I'm the Dean for Graduate Education at Geisinger School of Medicine, and I'm on the faculty there and also serve in the administrative role for strategy and planning.
Great. Well, this show is part of the Learning Communities Network, and you can find this and previous shows at learningcommunities.com. Our goal is that in today's times, where a lot of learning is virtual, and one way, we wanted to have a two-way conversation. So what we've done is we've brought together experts, in this case on culture. We're going to start a conversation amongst ourselves. But for those of you that are watching us live on YouTube, you're welcome to enter in any questions that you have for the panel, and we will try and address those as well. So again, if you go to youtube.com/Joe Perfetti, that's where you can see it live. You can also find us at learningcommunities.com and YouTube Live. And again, feel free to type in some questions for the panel. But as we get started today, I want to talk again about kind of the virtual nature of culture, especially with what's going on in today's times. But before we get there, what is culture and how do we define it? Because I think that's going to be important to set up the basis of our conversation. Anybody want to start?
Happy to jump in, Joe, and I would encourage others to critique things about the way I think about culture and add to it. So I like to think of a little mashup, which is really what are the rules that we develop in groups, in organizations, in countries that help guide our behaviors? What are the set of values, beliefs, mindsets, heroes, rituals, stories that accompany those rules? And in service of thinking about how do we then attribute meaning to various events, experiences, and roles that we're going through. So I like to think of those sort of three different components of culture. And that's been helpful for me as I'm working with organizations and assessing the role that leaders play in building and evolving cultures. But I would be curious to hear from the rest of the group on what you would add or change.
Yeah, I think that's a great definition, Lauren. When I'm working with organizations about how to kind of do something about culture, which is really where they're usually at, right? Like, how do we change our culture or strengthen or, it's always something about doing something to culture when I'm working with organizations. And I think in your definition where you talk about what governs our behavior, I think that's usually where I really hone in on is how do those beliefs, values manifest themselves in behaviors that you can observe, right? So, can you count how many times X behavior has happened? That's how you can start to see how culture becomes tangible as opposed to this kind of ether of the way we do things around here. And so thinking about behaviors and getting specific about the attributes you want in your culture and how those then play out through behaviors that you can observe is really where I try to anchor that definition.
So one of the things I just want to ask here and add, Maddie, is that when I discovered that you were a cultural anthropologist, which I mentioned on our last show, and I had no idea what that meant, and I found out that you studied culture and organizations, you always said that you start with incentives because they tell you a lot about a company's culture. So how does that play into our definition?
So I would say that you look at incentives as a guide or as a cheat sheet to see where a company is valuing certain types of behaviors, because a lot of times you'll see that, you know, they'll say things that they value X behavior, but that's really disincentivized in their incentive structure. So how are you expecting people to actually behave in that way if the incentives push against them? However, when you're trying to actually work with culture and shift culture, I think organizations start there as their solution first, whereas you really need to take several steps back to really understand what you're trying to accomplish first. I hear a lot about, we want a culture of innovation or a culture of empathy, and it's just these big words. And what I really try to get leaders to focus on is, okay, well, what does that actually mean? What do you want people to do differently than what they're doing today? And then after you've sort of set up that scaffolding of what you're trying to accomplish, what behaviors you're trying to get people to perform on their daily basis, then you can start using incentives and other types of kind of structural nudges to kind of rally people towards those behaviors. So I think in the analysis bit, looking at incentives is a really great place to start to see where there might be misalignments. But in the solutioning or the action bit, it should actually be one of the last things that you change or deal with to make sure that it's fully aligned with that whole kind of value chain of cultural behaviors.
And by the way, before we go, Renee, I just want to mention Elisa Johnson just joined us very quickly as an also panelist. Elisa, if you can just say 10 seconds about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And I apologize. It is the COVID time as well. And speaking of culture, I typically, I was trying to be early around this and I still had technical challenges. So apologies for this. Thanks. Elisa Johnson, I'm in the human capital and human resource space. I have about 22 years that I've been in the space and have been really just a champion around, putting culture at the forefront. And it's just been so wonderful to see how much we are giving culture and paying attention to it as a focus area. So it's great to be on this panel. I know so many of you here right now, and it's a lovely group. You've pulled a wonderful team together here, Joe, for this conversation.
Really appreciate you joining us. So back to Renee. Sorry, we're about to hear you're adding on to what Maddie said.
Hey, Elisa, it's great. I got a phone call. I thought I'd turned everything off right before you came, and I hadn't, so I popped out for a second. That's living. This is virtual, right?
I heard Madeline speak of empathy, so thanks for the empathy.
So I just wanted to underscore something that I think is so important about what Maddie is saying here, which is that one of the ways that we can see culture, which is a lot like trying, they use the comparison of a fish not really understanding water, right? It's just kind of your environment. One of the ways that we can see culture is in the results of it, because it's in the culture that our decision premises exist. And so many times we're not even fully aware of the strength of those. And I think we're seeing the power of that concept right now with a lot of our discussions around race and gender recently, where it is, if you look at the letter of a rule, the rule may seem equal on its face, and it's not until we start looking at the results of a rule or a law or a policy that we can see that there are these cultural influences that are shaping how it is that we come together as an organization, as a society, in groups.
And if I can add on that, Renee, that just reminded me of an anecdote of, thinking back, I think it was late 80s, early 90s to the mid 90s, where Microsoft had sort of that policy of stack ranking. And what they really thought that would do was encourage people to be competitive and bring their best to work. And, that it seemed like a good system to drive people to perform. But in reality, the impact of that was that because people were competitive, they were secretive because they needed to get credit in order to stay top ranked. And if you're encouraging people to need to have credit given to themselves, they don't share, and then you don't get that innovative collaboration. And so to your point, exactly, Renee, that like you have to think through the follow-on knock-on effects of any policy or any change, including incentives, including how you perform or how you evaluate performance. All of that, looking at the implications is really where you're going to see kind of the true effects of culture.
So there's a book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. Can there be good culture, bad culture?
Well,
Bob,
it goes back to
ahead.
It depends on whether you're looking at the effect or not. So here's where, in our postmodern culture, we tend to say there just is culture. And let's just look at what the effects of those, how we are following through on our values, the way that Maddie has pointed out that we sometimes, our behaviors are not aligned with what we say that our values are, right? And so we need to incentivize the actual behavior that we would like to see. That is one way to align those things. Most cultural anthropologists, at least, would tend to say there just is culture, and you can decide that it is not helping you reach your goals, and that it is misaligned with where the direction you would like to go in, and that it's not empowering your people in terms of how to think differently and think. If you want innovation, to think innovatively, right? It's getting in their way. But we don't tend to usually say good or bad. I'm just going to say we're starting to hear some voices, I think, especially lately in the last few months, where there's a question of that. And I think that is a very fair question to say, well, yes, but can we at least look at the consequences of what we're rewarding in our culture and what the rules are and who they privilege and who they don't?
Yeah, I definitely say there's a good culture for your goals versus a bad culture for your goals. But, you can take, classic Silicon Valley startup culture, and that's not actually going to be a good culture for somewhere where quality control and safety are the top goals, right? Because, experimentation, high turnover, things like that would impact your ability to deliver, let's say, on medical manufacturing, right? You don't necessarily in a manufacturing environment want a lot of risk taking. You want quality, you want consistency. So the same culture can be good or bad depending on, where you're trying to implement it. So that would be my only kind of assessment of good or bad is your culture helping you achieve what you want to achieve, or is it not? And, the how of that can change over time. So that would be my response, which is, I think, in alignment with what Renee said.
Great.
I think it's a great definition, both Renee and Maddie. The idea that the culture is a culture. We have culture. It exists, and I love how you tied that to does it align with what it is we're looking for and what it is we want to accomplish. And the great story is here we are 2 days from Independence Day, and we can talk about how the culture didn't fit. Wasn't the right, here's the Canadian telling the Americans what Independence Day, but you guys can fill in the blanks, but we tend to know a little bit about American history. I don't expect this to be reciprocal, though. So we do have, and that is a joke, by the way. That culture can certainly drive behaviors that are desirable and change and shift the values in a more positive way, and it can also shift them and keep them from moving where you want them to be. You can actually put roadblocks in the way, and we go back to the ideas of incentivization. Collective agreements can be one of the biggest barriers to keeping a culture keeping an organization down from being innovative, and that's one of the things that we need to look at is how can collective agreements create an environment, create a culture that allows for growth and innovation, unlike just stagnating, etc.
But I think one of the themes, and I wanted to talk about, in a mobile environment that we're now in, or I guess we'll call it a virtual environment. So I'll start with Elisa, because I know we had talked to your CEO at Brown and Tolan a few weeks ago, and she had made a comment that basically said that, we were thinking about moving to doing telehealth in 2 years, and we had to now figure it out in 2 weeks. And I assume, like most of everybody else on this call, because of COVID-19, the workforce went mobile, not by design, but because of the emergency situation we're in. How did that impact your culture at either Brown and Tolan or any of the other organizations you guys are part of? So I'll start with you, Elisa.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. It had a major impact in many ways because, you were just talking about between Maddie and Renee around, you walk into an organization, there's already a culture established. And, at Brown and Tolan, there wasn't necessarily, when I joined in fall of 2018, there wasn't necessarily this notion of working remote. I mean, people had some desires around that. But for the most part, it was very much a traditional culture of you come into the office and you're here, you've got your cube, you've got your office. And we had started the process, Kelly really wanting to lead the charge around, around innovation. That's one of our values, is innovation. So we had started this process around, from a talent aspect of getting some things in place and some infrastructure around becoming a little bit more virtual that would give us some flexibility from a talent angle as well. And so started that platform, and then here we are, to your point, in February, late February, as Kelly and I were going, boy, this is getting a little crazy. Seeing London Breed in San Francisco declare state of emergency before any other governor in the nation. And we moved. We had to move. I mean, we were literally out. And so when I think about, the culture aspect of this, of all of a sudden going from coming to your cube to, no, you got to work from home. And I don't even know how to get into VPN right now to get onto the network and everything. I think there's something to be said about, Scott and I always have conversations around the whole system. The system forced us here. The environment forced us to change behaviors pretty fast here. Yeah. And so I think about how does that play into changing culture in many ways. This movement with what we have around with Black Lives Matter. I was coming off an all hands meeting from our organization, virtual all hands, where we've got everyone on WebEx, and we do this every other week to stay collaborating, to stay connected in this virtual day and age. So it's amazing that we went from going into the office, I don't know how to log on from home, to we're all online now in a WebEx together in an all hands. And that just wouldn't have happened had we not been forced to in many ways when we look at these environmental factors. And today was our day of just in all hands talking about being able to be real around racism, making our declarative statement. So that's another piece that has been brought into our culture as a result of, you walk into cultures, but also I think what we're seeing today in terms of how the environment is shaping your culture too, because it's about how you're responding, how you're having your organization respond to it as well. And you don't get a choice. You have to interact with it. So that's...
I just wanted to add on. So Scott, you're a systems person. After listening to Elisa, I know the wheels have got to be turning here. So what, from a systems point of view, how does this matter? Is this a chicken and egg question? Is this circular? What's going on here?
Yeah, no. Well, first, I'm impressed at how fast Brown and Tolan moved, and what was it, Elisa? You were your organization had the second drive-through testing station in the nation, or maybe it was the first, but you moved fast in the city of Oakland and the Bay Area, which is a huge marketplace. So Yeah, I think of this systemically. Look, organizations are social systems. They come together because individuals wouldn't be able to do alone what they might do together. So for my questioning of executives and thinking about what we do at Geisinger, does our culture enable us to get things done? Is it enabling? Is it a disabling culture? Is it a culture that enables us to move with speed, or is it a culture that requires that we move slowly? And certainly in today's marketplace, we got to move quick, right? Things are changing moment to moment. The manner in which we describe COVID changes. Just as a case in point, I'm a student of higher education industry. So institutions across America are thinking, do we shut down athletics? And what will that mean? If you're Notre Dame and you shut down athletics, that means that you forfeit. And I picked this, Maddie, for you. It means that if you shut down, touchdown Jesus, and if you shut down that wonderful, wonderful experience, that is, $12 million just on campus alone for that game. That doesn't count for the nearly $12 billion that takes place across the nation when you look at, the networks and all of these other things. So Cornell came out, and I'll yield after this. Cornell came out with a study yesterday of Cornell University, why they will open campus in the fall. So very smart people at Cornell, statistical modelers, came out and they said, we think we can do better interacting with COVID by opening our campuses. Statistically, we'll have a less likelihood of an outbreak than if we don't open and don't put into place all of the precautions and measures that we will for opening. So, that would be, in my mind, an enabling culture. Cornell is interacting with a complex problem. Its culture enabled it to have a point of view and to take action, albeit even in the face of controversy. So, it's a system, but it's a system that is opt-in culture, and it either enables you to do things or it disables you from doing things.
I love that, talking about this moment in time. Their culture is visible right now in a way that it just isn't normally, because it's been disrupted, right? And with any disruption, we can see what the implicit rules are, because all of a sudden they don't apply, or they're awkward, or we don't exactly know what to do with them or what the right decision is. We have to actually stop and think about it. Culture enables us to kind of go on autopilot to an extent, right? But I'll give you a funny example of like how we are building culture in the moment and saying, okay, if this is what we value, how do we express it? So I've been working on, we had a similar experience where we had a very quick leave taking of the office. And we went out, basically, we said we were going to test it on a Thursday. And by Friday, we were able to say this is a success and it's necessary for us to keep our people safe. And so this is what we're going to do. Well, we're now planning how do we return to office. And so I went in for a walk of the floors. And it was eerie because I walked in and St. Patty's Day decorations are up and calendars are in March and coffee cups are sitting next to people's computers, right? And so now we're saying, we would really love for you to come back and collaborate, because it is true that when we are in a room together, it is different than when we are only collaborating via video. And so I'm trying to figure out, how do we help people juggle things like, well, if I'm in a conference room, I have to wear a mask. Does that feel like we're together? I don't know. And so I've been trying to think of, how can we help people navigate this awkwardness of what it means to be human in that moment. Gee, I might be contagious and I'm going to put this mask on to be a good community member. I've been kind of thinking maybe I'm going to compare it to zombie apocalypse, and tell people your mask is like a bat for when the zombies are coming. And, it's like, would you not pick up your bat? Well, of course you would pick up your bat. So you got to pick up your mask, got to put your mask on, because this is what we do for each other. That is an endorsement of us as a community. And it's not an easy one, because then we have a lot of individuals who feel like, okay, but what about me? What about my performance? What about my self-expression? And those are all valid as well. So it's just an incredibly interesting moment where we're making difficult decisions that sometimes these big decisions are actually in this tiny little action, to get back to Maddie's initial focus on behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So underlying all of this, when I listen to Lisa, Scott, and even your story, Renee, it also suggests that there's some things that, and I use the word, I think Scott said this, enabling conditions that allow cultures to move faster, be more successful, and others that become barriers. So in all of these experiences that you're talking about, what are some of the conditions as a leader that I can look for, that I can make sure that whether it's foisted upon me or not, I'm better prepared?
I can kick that off. One thing that I've noticed, and it came up recently on a call that we did, a virtual summit series that we're doing in collaboration with Accenture, around supply chains. And we had Mark Engel from Unilever there. And I think he exhibited this. What he did was he talked about the core values that they had already developed deeply within their supply chain, and how they were connecting them to decisions, responses, behaviors at this moment in time. So he really said, as an organization, one of the things they've looked at is these 5 new work streams: safety of the people, community, what they can do to protect lives and livelihoods, keeping operations running, adjusting for changes in demand and agility, which we've been talking about. And then the last one was really protecting the company and managing the cash. And all of those things that they're focused on at this moment in time, responding to COVID, align with values that they've deeply embedded within the organization, that connects to work that they've done on a global supply chain around sustainability, with their workforce, lifting up innovation. So I think one thing I would look for is what the leader has already been doing to the work around values. That's really hard work, and it shows up in lots of different ways in organizations.
Yeah, I would add, kind of building on that piece of, what the organization's been doing to live their values before this kind of moment of disruption and crisis. But in terms of kind of individual characteristics that we've been thinking about and emphasizing from a leadership point of view when it comes to culture through crisis, and Elisa, you brought it up, or you mentioned it, is this idea of empathy, right? That, starting with empathy. One phrase we've been using is acknowledge the weird. All of us are dealing with a lot of weird stuff right now. That, you've got your dogs and your kids and your spouse, and, you're also home when you might not have the right tools. And so everybody's going through a weird period right now. And so if you start from a point of empathy and then actions come from there with an acknowledgement that individual differences are going to impact people differently, right? There are very visible impacts, right? Like, I have to homeschool my kids. I have to, manage the whole household now. But then there's also challenges that aren't as visible, that, you might be afraid for a grandparent, or that being in isolation is much more difficult for you because you're an extrovert at your core, right? And so thinking about starting with empathy and acknowledging the differences that your people are experiencing right now, and giving equal credence to these different types of difficulties, I think is an enabling condition for a culture to be able to adapt in these very disruptive times.
Yeah. Joe, we talk a lot about architecture. What's the architecture in place? And in fact, I was reminded, and I don't know how long ago it was, but I think certainly Elisa was there. Maddie, you may have been in the room, but we're in Philadelphia in a hotel room, and we're talking about, remember that? We're talking about, so, what's agility? What, is it structural? Can we architect it? And, we started talking about agile architecture. So what do you expect from your leaders? I think that you look around, what's the architecture that leaders have put in place so that culture is enabling rather than disabling. And there are some characteristics of of architecture. Can I get to a decision rapidly? Once I decide, can I implement with speed? Once we implement, what do we do if we were wrong or if we got it right? So that agile architecture, that foundation or underpinning that leaders should have, could still be putting in place in real time to ensure the success of the company, that's part of the culture. So, I always look at, so what's the structure? And I don't mean the structure, what's the building or whatever. I mean, what's the structure of the relationships, of the patterns of behaviors and the way we engage. That's what I'm looking for from leaders today.
I love that you said that, Scott. I think that individual, the building of the individual interactions is something that we often miss. And, I would just say that in terms of consulting, it's so critical not to just work top down, but to empower the people who are actually doing, and they are the experts on the front lines, and they are guiding the actual work that needs to be done. And it's so important not to lose sight of what is that work and how do we get it done. That says something about who we are, and helping people have those conversations, not just telling them you need to have this conversation, but here's a model. I loved that you said modeling, here's what it could sound like. And just walking them through that. There's a great comfort, I think, in that, and a very big power.
Yeah.
Joe, I want to jump in here because I'm listening to what everyone's saying and such great stuff. And I've kind of come up with a new definition for culture. I could probably good, but here's my in the moment definition of culture based upon this virtual environment that we're in, and that's what do you do what do you do first in that moment of ambiguity? That for me is your culture takes over in that moment of ambiguity. And the virtual world has caused us to either take it on very well or be challenged by it and not take it on very well. And I'll give you a great example. And when we, and Joe, you've seen it, and Scott, you've seen it. And, when we do the Pick Your Challenge, we give people the opportunity to go change tires on the race car. And then we come back and we talk about it. And the first question I ask is, what did you talk about first? What did you talk about on your teams before you changed the tires? And I get everything from, we looked at strategy, we looked at what the roles would be. They go through strategic process type things. And then we'll try to get them on some of the people stuff. Like how did you determine who would do what role, et cetera, et cetera. Once we've kind of exhausted all that, I ask the question, did any groups discuss values before you started? And I can tell you, over 19,000 people through Pit Crew over the years, average of about 25 at a time. So we've done this quite a bit. And the review is, no one talks about values before they start. They just tend to jump right into, because what the Pit Crew challenge is completely ambiguous. They've never changed tires on a race car before with a group of other people. And they're jumping into this thing for the first time ever. And they just went right at it until someone reminded them that values would have been a good conversation to start. What's important, what's driving this, and defining those values again and going through it. So I think one of the ways that we can deal with our culture in this virtual world, hey, if you haven't already jumped into the virtual world, you're 3 months too late. But there's no better time to start than now. If you're in there, that's the old saying. And that for me is, as a leader, making sure that when there's ambiguity, we're starting in the right spot. People will tend to go, culture will take over. And for a lot of people, that's just get in, divide, conquer, command, control, process, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just an observation.
So Bob, I really like what you're saying, and it makes intellectual sense. But I'm just trying to be practical here for a second. So we got a COVID-19 crisis. I got to shift my workforce overnight to go work at home. Am I really going to stop to say, hold on a second, we got to have a values conversation?
Yes.
Is that going to
Yes.
is that going to happen? Yes. Why are people
Yes.
not?
That's for me. For me, yes, that's what you should do. It's not going to happen. That's my point. Well, what I'm trying to say is a good culture, or let's just say there's no good culture, bad culture. I'll even agree with that. The culture that does well is the one that knows exactly what it needs to do, and that the values are so very well entrenched that we may not have to have the value conversation, but it's very well established. But for me, I'm always about reminders, and reminders in the moment are always good. And reminder can just be a 10-second conversation. Remember what our values are, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Yep, we're all good. Move on. But if there's anyone that says, oh, wait a minute, that third one there, what was that one again? Then we've got a culture problem. That's my thought. I'm curious to hear what other people have to say about that.
I have a really good, actually, recent practicality around this as well, Bob, because what you have shared and what Scott and Lauren as well around the whole values conversation. And a couple of weeks ago, well, I'm just going to go back to a second in terms of our time. So we have COVID, and then we layer this on with the George Floyd situation and the social unrest that's happening. And, right away, we have all these companies that go out and respond. They come out with their letters, their declarations, which is fabulous, by the way. It's wonderful. In our organization, it was interesting because we didn't go out right away. And we're a significant healthcare organization in the Bay Area. And so what, as I'm listening to everyone around, the values discussion, because we didn't, because of our values for the moment, we needed to make sense of this as an organization collectively, individually and collectively, knowing that this was some deep stuff coming on, some interesting conversations that could be had. And so, collaboration, empathy, we decided to not react, but respond. So we went out to the organization and we had listening sessions first. We talked with our board around this, had this very critical conversation. And over the past week, Kelly, who's our CEO, who is the mastermind, because she always thinks about our values when she's trying to go through ambiguity. I mean, this was a big, situation of ambiguity. We co-created with our employees, our board, our executive team, who said, hey, this is about our values with whatever we go out to, first and foremost. And in this time frame on Juneteenth, when I'm having listening sessions, the one thing that I was checking for as well is how vulnerable are people going to be? How open are they going to be about this discussion? The COO and myself facilitated these discussions. I didn't know what I was going to get. I was pleasantly surprised because it said a lot about our culture when we had these small groups totally open up, interact, be real, be respectful, but we had a very direct conversation about racism and people's different experiences. We had people in tears. We had people, frustrated. We had people going, okay, how do I put a value on this? I need to care for patients and so forth. And it was, it's probably been some of the most powerful discussions that I've had in being in the corporate world for so long. But that was very telling to me about our culture, that individuals felt like they could talk. Because when you have a mute organization, which is always the challenge, I'm referring to Huggy Hyagriva Rao's book on scaling up excellence. When your organization becomes big, the challenges become, you have the risk of it becoming mute. Mm-hmm. And that has always stuck with me. You cannot have muteness in your organization. That is what is such a huge erosion of culture.
Yeah.
Hey, Lisa, did you have these conversations virtually?
Yes, it was all virtual, WebEx. We weren't on camera. Sometimes with technology, You know, the whole distraction around watching others, the multitasking with watching others while you're trying to see yourself and go, okay, do I look right? Do others look right? We just wanted this to be about, let's get on a call. Let's just be on the phone and listen. This was about listening and understanding.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Maddie.
I was just going to say, I think that's such a great story. Going into team and culture research, kind of one of the number one predictors of performance is the presence of psychological safety and the ability to be vulnerable with one another and the ability to share and have those tough conversations. So I definitely think that that's such a great indicator. If people feel comfortable having those tough conversations, that, the culture is doing something right. But back also to Joe's question about, do we stop to have that values conversation when the walls are crumbling down? Yes, I think that's one of the number one biases in organizations, that you just focus on the what instead of the how, and that you end up having to go back and fix things because you didn't talk about the how before. So it's this whole idea of slowing down to speed up.
Right.
And hopefully you're not having a conversation about values for the first time ever, right? When this is happening, because then you maybe have bigger problems. Instead, I think it's more about recontextualizing those values, recontextualizing, what our culture means and what it looks like in a virtual mode, right? Redefining the expectations of, these sort of values or these cultural norms that we had in person, this is what it's going to look like in virtual. So Renee, to your point, how do you model the right behaviors? That you want to keep the thread and the meaning behind kind of those cultural norms, but you have to recontextualize. You have to remodel what that looks like. Maybe it does mean more video calls when you normally would have just had a phone call, but maybe it means turning the video off because that allows you to focus on the content and the tone as opposed to just the body language and the visuals.
That's right.
So I do think it is important to have these conversations and to reestablish the goalposts to say, okay, this is what is now expected of you, because there is that awkwardness and uncertainty around what culture means when we're not together, right? Because there is this notion that culture is about how we're together. So if we're not physically together, what does culture mean when we are digitally together or virtually together? And so then what are those new behaviors? We either need to adopt new behaviors, adapt old behaviors, get rid of some behaviors that, may have furthered our culture in the physical world, but are actually not great in the virtual world. So it's all about that recontextualization, I think, to help you be more successful so you don't have to come back and fix things later.
So Elisa, and to some degree, Maddie, we got a comment that came up on our YouTube live channel, basically from Josh Shannon saying that, is this a one-time conversation? Shouldn't this be ongoing? Like what's happening with Brown and Tolan? How are you going to make this an ongoing conversation? Because I assume in this one conversation, people might have come to tears, but is that enough?
Yeah, we actually, that's great, because we talked about it in these calls that this isn't about just a conversation, this is about action. So we came together, pulled together a collective communication that is representative of our whole organization, not just the leadership team. And we had a series of actions that we also laid out, that what we are changing right now, what we are going to aspire to, the continuing conversation. So we set up a virtual site on Teams as well, where we want people to interact in this conversation, put out resources there, educate us. This is about reflection and learning and education. So we're going to have a site out on Microsoft Teams that's specifically for this, because we can get some really great ideas of what to do next from all of our team members. And we also said in our communication, this is just the start. It's not the end.
So I have an observation, and then I have a direct question, which I'm going to start with Scott and Lauren. So be prepared. But my observation is, very recently.
Get ready, Lauren.
Exactly. I'm just warning you, the fastball is going to be coming right down the plate. But in all seriousness, very recently, is it a coincidence that we've heard a lot of conversation about the power of why and purpose? Like McKinsey's all over it. Duke has been pushing it. They wrote a book on it. You have the Simon Sinek stuff. I mean, is that relevant to this conversation? Because if you have, it sounds like what I'm hearing in this call is if you have a strong purpose why of your organization, then that is the conversation that allows you to move. Because if you don't, then you're screwed, and then you got to have that conversation, and you can't just go to the JFDI, just F and do it mode. Is that what I'm kind of hearing this group saying?
Go ahead, Lauren.
Yeah.
That's not my question, but there's going to be a tougher question that follows. But go ahead.
Great.
Let's go with you, Scott. Let's go with you.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, I would say that the why is your anchor. And we talked about it last week as we were talking about high-performing teams, that one of the things that we'll see when teams start to go astray is if there isn't clarity around goals and alignment around goals. And I think deeper than that is sort of thinking about how that also connects to personal values and why people are working within organizations, what matters to them in that moment of time, and how they can help with progress, innovation, whatever it is that they're working to achieve. So I think that why really matters, and I think it shifts. And so creating a structure within an organization to revisit those conversations at a regular cadence can be really powerful.
Just before you,
oh, go ahead.
just before you go off that, Joe, to amplifying Lauren's point, Bob mentioned as we were getting ourselves together, storytelling. That why, you remember the story, right? So I'm a fan of our CEO at Geisinger, Jay Wanru, for a variety of reasons. But one reason I'm a fan is because he boiled it down to the following phrase. We need to make healthcare easier, better healthcare easy. Okay, why? Well, because the health and well-being of our communities depend on it. Why? Because if we don't have healthy communities, people aren't going to live here. Why? Well, you can keep going with this. People remember that. But what people don't remember is we're doing this because of the strategic intervention of, this international pandemic. What? You just lost me. International pandemic. Now I'm sick. I'm afraid. But if you say, I've got to make this easy, and here's why, people remember that. They just do. I think we're going to see more of the Simon Sinek-like books coming out. You talked earlier also about what are we reading. I read this great book, Simple Rules. Do you have a few simple guiding rules in order to run your company, run your business, run your team, interact with culture, interact with the business problem? Do you have simple rules? And if the answer is yes, you've got that agile architecture. You've probably got a good cultural vibe going, and you got to keep it simple. And people need to know why. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, they make it up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. So here's my question, which I'm now going to throw to a different person.
Bob.
All right. So Bob and Renee.
Okay.
Who is the responsible person for the culture at the organization?
Whoa.
Who?
Oh, we're getting metaphysical here, are we?
Why? But I want to get to the who. So Renee, since you're the VP of Talent and Culture, you should be easy.
All right. I'm not telling my secrets next time. No, I'm just kidding. I think everyone. And here's what I would say is that we so often think of, that would be the simple answer, right? To put a period at the end of that sentence. And yet, I think it's so critical for us to understand that our employees also exist in other cultures. They have a own culture. They have other organization cultures. They have a larger culture. They have a background culture. Yeah. And they're navigating all of these at any given time. And so for us to say as an organization, here's the culture and you are the keeper of it, is to limit them to an extent. And I think that calling on people in their whole aspect, I'm not saying bring your problems all to work, that's, but understanding that people are whole and treating them that way with respect goes a long way to demonstrating a value, that they are valuable and they want to come to work then, and they want to lend their talents then, and that's engagement.
Bob?
Great answer, Renee. I love that you brought up that people are involved in different cultures and from one moment to the next. And that brings us back. Maddie brought up the concept of psychological safety, and I'm sure everyone here knows the story, but people might not know the story about how psychological safety came to a head. And that was obviously the Google study that was done a number of years back on their teams, right? And for anyone who's not listening to this and is not familiar with it, just Google psychological safety. Google psychological safety, but Google in the search bar. And you'll come up with that study. You'll find, I think it was New York Times, am I right? Was it a New York Times article?
I believe so. Project Aristotle.
Yeah. So, but what that study also recognized that each team, you may be a member of 5 different teams at Google, and each team had its own culture, and each team functioned well because of their own psychological safety in each of those teams. So to suggest that we even have one culture within a company would be so wrong. To suggest that, and particularly larger companies even more so. There may be some overarching themes around those values. There's no question, but I think if you talk about who the holder of those of that culture is, it's going to come down to each individual team, and then obviously the individual members on those teams to make sure that we are holding each other to those cultures that cultural norms or ensuring that culture is benefiting us as a team and ultimately the organization at the end of the day. So it fits in many, many different places.
Well, thanks for taking that tough question, Bob and Renee. Actually, we've got another great one from, again, Josh.
Can I add before you bring that up?
All right.
So I just want to add nuance or semantics is when we think about who's responsible for the culture, I think it is everybody, but then there's also an accountability, right? That I think lands with leadership to make sure that responsibility is taken up and that, appropriate actions are taken and that, that the organization is moving in the right direction. So I think there's accountability and responsibility that falls in different places. So that was just my 2 cents.
Well, the other part of the who, so again, I'm going to take this question from our audience and throw it to Scott. How does this play in with mission and values, your traditional strategy approach? So how do you want to answer that, Scott?
Well, I got to look at this a little more carefully, but I don't think you ever scrap your mission and your values, but I think that your mission and your values continuously interact, right? They're interacting with the marketplace. That doesn't mean that you don't know what it is, but to pretend that a bunch of words written on something can be held constant indefinitely means that as an organization, you can't live in or deny multiple realities. And, we're living in multiple realities. The best organizations are able to navigate the uncertainty of finding themselves in different systems, in different subsystems. We live in a marketplace. Great. Well, we live in a societal culture. We have to care about the health and well-being of people. Sometimes systems are in conflict. So while you never scrap mission and vision, your values are something that you've got to continuously define. Every great organization has sense-making devices. How do you talk about these things? We've mentioned this before in lots of our conversations, but I'll focus in on Elisa for a moment. I'm a big fan of the Kinefin framework. Snowden and IBM got something right when they said, hey, if we can stay together and interact when we feel that we're in a state of disorder, imagine what we can do when we have, some basic problems. Imagine what we might do better with complexity or chaos. So, to the question by Joshua here, no, you never scrap your mission and value, but it evolves, it grows.
Well, but let me bring up, there's a second part of this question, though, that I think is important, because I struggle with this personally, which is, do you have a core mission and values that's sort of unchangeable, or does it become completely situational? Because in a way, you guys are arguing, oh, we got a crisis, let's all talk about our values and update our values and then go do it. But if our values are universal, then does that start to confuse people when they start to see changes in the value conversation.
Yeah.
Oh, were you going to speak, Renee?
Go for it, Maddie.
I mean, I would say that a focus on values is something that needs to be constant and consistent and evergreen. How those values are expressed or how you articulate them may need to adapt situationally, right? As we learn more and as we grow more, we might realize we've left people out of those values, that those values may not include everyone in the ways we think that it is. So, to say any of these pieces, mission, vision, values should be unchanging, I think is incorrect, that they should all be evolving as we learn more, as we grow, as we are faced with different disruption. But I think values anchoring us helps us make sure that the vision and mission aren't being over-indexed based on market volatility, that we
Right.
have some sort of core that's bringing us back. Because, we've all heard this quote of change is faster than it's ever been and it'll never be this slow again, right? We have to recognize that business model transformation is part of the new norm, right? So your vision and your mission may change substantially because, your business model is no longer valid in the new market reality. But
Right.
you can still enact your values through new business models. You can still be the same organization. And that's one of the things that when we think about the corporation as an entity in the historical trajectory, part of what changed the corporation from other forms of business and organizations is that the corporation outlives any individuals, right? That the corporation is something that continues, even if you're switching out the CEO, if you're switching out people, there's some sort of essence that continues through. And the values is part of that essence, I would argue.
Yeah. And reminder, we are rethinking and deconstructing monuments all over our country right now.
That's
So do our values change? Absolutely, they do. Does our interpretation of reality and ideal evolve? God, let's hope so. Because if not, the human predicament, consciousness is an alarming, scary thing. Not to move us off of the business context here, but consciousness is a pill that we need to take every day, and we need to find it.
Well, go ahead.
Just one quick other concept that I think is helpful to remember, which is that all of these are a social contract, and like any contract, we would revisit the terms periodically, right?
Yeah.
And it's actually a very healthy thing for us to do.
You bet. Really important point, Renee.
Well, and again, we're coming to the end of our time here today, and I want to thank everybody for their contributions, because to me, it sounds like the most important thing I'm getting out of this call, and you guys can emphasize this as well, is that if your organization hasn't stopped and had the values conversation, you really need to have it quickly. Because anytime, as Bob said, we're about to go through a major change, if you don't have it and you don't understand it, you're going to have it anyways. It's just a question of when and how painful that conversation is going to be. And as Elisa said, it's a continuous conversation. It's not just one time, and it's not just one way. Like I had a graphic I was going to use as a joke, but it seems almost apropos here, where basically the boss is telling everybody he wants his top-down culture. I'm going to impose this on my organization. And that's not what anyone here sounds like they're saying. That it needs to be an inclusive conversation. And when I asked who owns it, it really does need to not just be the very top of the organization. I hope I got that right. But as we do kind of close, just very quickly, before we shut down, it is summer and we're about to head into the 4th of July weekend. So does anybody have any quick suggestions for readings or things that you would suggest that people are listening that they might want to consider? Anybody want to jump out first? Bob, what do you got?
Rehumanizing leadership. Just start into it.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's the 10 seconds on that one? Why?
Your purpose, your organizational purpose. Hone in on the topic of today.
All right. What else do we got?
I have one, and I actually have a request. I would love to revisit in another session our original question, which is to hone in on the technology piece of culture. And I think our time was really well spent today, because if you don't do this exploration, it's very hard to do the other. But in preparation for that, I have a book that I would recommend, trying to get around that icon there, called Super Minds.
Okay.
And it is fabulous. It is seriously good. It is about not about machines taking our jobs. It is about us thinking collectively and being able to connect to each other in ways that brings the best expertise in connection with the best expertise to solve problems.
Great. Anybody else?
I can suggest one. It's a little from left field. I miss traveling, as you can probably tell by the title that I'm going to suggest. It's Understanding Global Cultures, and it's a book about looking at metaphors. And I think it can put you in a creative space thinking about your own culture when you look at other countries and using that device of metaphors.
Great.
Yeah.
Scott, Maddie, Elisa?
I
Yeah,
have not
I've
been reading much. I've been spending time in my hammock to decompress. That's my tip, is to just
That's okay.
step away sometimes, because I feel like in this new virtual environment, you're just constantly being bombarded and you don't actually give your brain time to disconnect and run its subconscious cycle. So I've actually been consciously not consuming as much media outside of work and just taking naps in my hammock.
Fair enough. Scott?
Yeah, I'm going to offer two. So one's an oldie but a goodie by Russ Akoff, the late Russ Akoff, called The Art of Problem Solving. Oftentimes leaders don't think through how do we address problems, and there are multiple ways to address a problem. That consciousness is so important. And then I mentioned Simple Rules by Soul and Eisenhardt. Great book. It's an easy read. It's the kind of thing that will cause you to think, but not leave you dumbfounded for too long. So that's what I've done. But I'm desperately in search of Maddie's hammock as well. I got to get one.
I'll send you a Google Pen.
Real quick.
I agree, Maddie. I might be cuddling up with you in that hammock, virtually, of course. So, I had already mentioned this book, and it's my go-to. I always think about it when we're talking about culture. So it is Huggy Rao's book on scaling up excellence. A lot of storytelling, a lot about the why, the how, and just the art of storytelling in that to get to the point here and how we scale up excellence.
Great.
Joe, there's a gap between your bookshelves. Is this the book that you're reading?
Exactly. It's the one I have on my list by Bowman and Deal. It's called Reframing Organizations. Just talking about how to do some of these changes, particularly around values that we have been discussing. So I'm cheating because I actually have a graphic for that one. But, other than that, I just want to again thank the panel. I want to thank everybody for listening. Again, please feel free to continue the conversation with us and learn more information about anything we're talking about at learningcommunities.com, which is where you'll find replays of this show, others, as well as connections to anyone that has been on the show. So again, thank you. Remember, tomorrow Hamilton comes out. So if you're also looking for a good thing to do over this weekend, have that. But unfortunately, the professors all have to go back to work. So thanks for joining us for this episode.
We're back to vacation.
Exactly. All right, we're done. Thanks, everybody. All right,
Thank
bye.
you.
Independence Day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.